They didn't come to stop you because you were weak. They came because you were becoming unstoppable. Let that sit with you. Read it again if you need to. Because the moment the resistance showed up, the moment the whispers turned into attacks and the doubt turned into pressure, that wasn't a sign you were off track. That was confirmation. Storms don't form around empty fields. Pressure doesn't visit places with nothing valuable beneath them. And enemies don't waste energy on people who don't matter. So let me talk to you directly, not around you, not past you, but straight through the noise. Yes, you. The one who keeps asking, why me? The one wondering why it feels like you're being watched, challenged, tested and provoked from every angle. The one sensing that something is different, heavier, sharper about this season. You're not imagining it. You were never paranoid. You were being prepared. Here's the truth they don't want you to understand. Opposition is proof of selection. You don't get targeted unless you're carrying something dangerous to the system that benefits from you staying small. Mediocrity is ignored. Comfort is tolerated. Conformity is rewarded. But potential that refuses to bow, that gets attacked. They see it in you even when you're still doubting yourself. That's the part that should wake you up. While you're questioning your strength, they're already trying to neutralize it. While you're asking if you're ready, they're hoping you never realize that you already are. Because once you do, once that switch flips, you're no longer manageable. You might be asking yourself right now, if I'm chosen, why does it hurt this much? Because chosen doesn't mean protected from pressure. Chosen means trusted with weight. Fire doesn't destroy gold. It reveals it. The heat you're in isn't meant to burn you out. It's meant to burn everything off you that can't go where you're going. They want you emotional because emotion clouds judgment. They want you tired because exhaustion makes you negotiable. They want you distracted because focus is lethal. So every delay, every provocation, every attempt to pull you into reaction is strategic. But here's where it backfires on them. Every hit they throw sharpens you. Every insult trains your restraint. Every obstacle strengthens your spine. Think of a blade. It doesn't become dangerous by being admired. It becomes dangerous by being struck, heated, and hammered. Over and over again. What they meant to break you is shaping you into something precise. You've probably wondered, why does it feel like I'm walking alone? Because crowds dilute calling. Noise interferes with clarity, and chosen paths are narrow by design. Not because you're better, but because you're responsible for something bigger. You don't need an audience right now. You need alignment. You don't need approval. You need accuracy. They'll try to label you difficult, arrogant, detached, cold. Let them. Labels are what people use when they can't control outcomes. What they're really saying is you're no longer predictable. And unpredictability terrifies systems built on routine. Here's a question they secretly ask themselves when they look at you. Why didn't they break? They expected the pressure to make you fold, to make you shrink, to make you apologize for your ambition. Instead, it made you quieter, sharper, more intentional, and silence, when backed by strength, is intimidating. So don't waste energy trying to explain yourself. Lions don't argue with opinions. Mountains don't defend their height. And you don't owe clarity to people committed to misunderstanding you. Use it. Use the resistance. Use the doubt they throw at you as fuel. Use the fact that they're watching as proof that what you're building matters. Every time they try to discourage you, let it remind you that you're moving forward. Every time they underestimate you, let it deepen your discipline. Every time they hope you'll quit, let it strengthen your resolve. You are not here to blend in. You are not here to be liked by everyone. You are here to become undeniable. And that requires a season where comfort is stripped away and conviction is tested. Chosen doesn't mean elevated without effort. It means entrusted with transformation. It means you're being trained to stand when others fold, to decide when others hesitate, to move when others wait for permission. So if you feel the weight, good. If you feel the resistance, even better. That's not the universe pushing you away. That's reality responding to your rise. Keep going, keep sharpening, keep becoming. They may be loud now, but history is written by the ones who outlast the noise. And you're still standing. Before we go any further, pause right here. This is the moment where something shifts from being something you listen to into something you own. If any line so far hit a nerve, stirred anger, strength, clarity, or courage inside you, don't brush it off. That reaction matters. Write it out. Say what you're feeling. Say what you've been holding back. Say what you've never said out loud because you thought no one would understand. This space is not for judgment, it's for truth. When you put your thoughts into words, you turn awareness into power. Let your voice be heard. When you put it into writing, you claim it. You support yourself that you are right and they are wrong. Just think about it and share it in the comment section and let your voice take up space. God bless you with his special blessings. Let's move towards it. Number 1. The day you stopped asking and started moving alone. The rupture moment. No permission, no backup, no delay. They didn't lose control when you became strong. They lost control when you stopped asking for permission. That was the day everything broke open. Not exploded, not announced, broke open, quietly, internally. The day you realized that waiting was costing you more than failure ever could. The day you felt something snap, not in anger, but in clarity. No more asking, no more explaining, no more checking the temperature of the room before deciding who you were allowed to become. This is where it begins for people like you. Not with applause, not with support, but with a rupture. A clean internal break from hesitation, from consensus, from the illusion that someone was coming to validate your timing. You felt it, didn't you? That moment where delay suddenly felt dangerous, where standing still felt heavier than moving forward alone, where you understood, without anyone telling you, that if you waited any longer, you would betray yourself. That wasn't impulse, that wasn't recklessness, that was instinct reclaiming control. And the moment you moved without asking, everything shifted. Let's address what the resistance calls an enemy move. They'll say you became selfish. They'll say you changed. They'll say you stopped being cooperative. What they mean is this: you stopped being accessible. You stopped orbiting their expectations. You stopped adjusting your pace to accommodate their comfort. That's when they noticed. Because systems don't react to intention. They react to action. The second you stopped asking, "Is this okay?" and started acting like your time mattered, you disrupted the balance. Not because you attacked them, but because you withdrew your dependence. And that is far more threatening. You may have asked yourself in that moment, why does it feel so lonely all of a sudden? Because permission creates company, movement creates distance, and distance reveals who was only close because you were standing still. Here's the part they don't want you to understand. Asking keeps power distributed. Moving alone concentrates it. When you ask, you scatter your authority into other people's opinions. When you move, you reclaim it, fully, instantly. Think about fire. A spark asks nothing. It doesn't negotiate with the dark. It doesn't wait for approval from the cold. It ignites, and suddenly everything around it has to respond. That's what you became the moment you moved without permission. A point of ignition. They didn't try to stop you because you were wrong. They tried because you were irreversible. And yes, the questions came fast. What if I fail? What if I'm wrong? What if I lose people? But beneath those questions was the one that mattered most, the one you finally answered honestly. What if I don't go? Because deep down, you knew the truth. Failure would hurt, but staying would hollow you out. Losing people would sting, but losing yourself would destroy you. Being wrong was survivable. Living unexpressed was not. So you moved. No backup plan, no audience, no safety net. That wasn't arrogance. That was alignment. Chosen paths don't come with crowds at the start. They come with friction. They come with silence. They come with the kind of solitude that forces you to hear yourself clearly for the first time. This is where the enemy miscalculates. They think isolation weakens you. They think separation makes you fragile. But separation is how force is refined. A blade isn't forged in a group. Pressure isn't shared. Transformation is solitary by nature. While they were still asking for consensus, you were already in motion. While they were debating possibilities, you were testing reality. While they were waiting for permission slips from circumstances, you were writing your own authorization through action. And that's when the fear flipped sides. They started watching instead of advising, critiquing instead of guiding, questioning instead of leading, because the moment you move without asking, you expose the lie they've been living inside. That movement was always available. That permission was never required. That waiting was a choice. You became dangerous, not because you attacked the system, but because you proved it wasn't absolute. Let's be clear about something important for you, right here, right now. Being chosen does not mean being lucky. It means being unable to ignore the internal signal to move. It means discomfort with stagnation. It means an intolerance for false stability. It means you feel misaligned when you play small, even when small is safe. Chosen people don't wait well. They don't stall gracefully. They don't age comfortably inside potential. They feel urgency where others feel patience. They feel pressure where others feel peace. And eventually, that pressure demands motion. So if you're wondering, why couldn't I just stay? The answer is simple. Because you were built for forward momentum. Stillness was never your assignment. Agreement was never your destination. You didn't move because you were fearless. You moved because fear stopped being a reason. You moved because something inside you understood that the cost of delay had surpassed the cost of action. And now, whether you fully realize it or not, you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Once you experience what it feels like to move without asking, you can never go back to waiting comfortably. You can never unknow that your will has weight, that your decision carries force. That motion changes reality. They'll try to pull you back into discussion, into debate, into delay disguised as wisdom. But you know better now. You've tasted momentum. You've felt what happens when action replaces permission. So don't apologize for the rupture. Don't explain the movement. Don't soften the fact that you chose yourself when no one else would. That day wasn't reckless. It was necessary. It was the day you stopped asking and started becoming. Number 2, when the crowd bet against you. Mockery, doubt, and the quiet satisfaction they expected from your failure. There's a specific moment you remember, even if you don't talk about it. The moment you realized the room had already decided your outcome, not because they knew your limits, but because they were projecting theirs. They didn't need evidence. They didn't need facts. They just needed comfort. And nothing comforts the crowd more than believing the one who stepped out will fall. They smiled when you left. Not openly, not loudly, but with that quiet satisfaction that comes from certainty. The kind that says, they'll be back. The kind that assumes your courage is temporary and your resolve is theatrical. They didn't chase you. They didn't warn you. They watched. Because crowds don't intervene when they think gravity will do the work for them. They bet against you without placing a visible wager. Their currency was doubt. Their investment was mockery disguised as concern. Be realistic. Don't rush. You're going to regret this. Those weren't warnings. Those were predictions rooted in fear. Fear that if you succeeded, it would expose how long they've been standing still. Here's what you understood before they ever did. Crowds don't gamble on outcomes, they gamble on patterns, and you broke the pattern the moment you refused to perform familiarity. You didn't follow the arc they expected. You didn't ask how high you was allowed to go. You didn't slow down to make their expectations comfortable. And that unsettled them more than failure ever could. They thought your isolation would weaken you. They assumed distance would drain you. They believed the absence of applause would make you doubt yourself, because that's how it works for them. Their confidence is a reflection. Their courage is conditional. Take away the crowd, and they disappear. But you didn't. You may have wondered, why do they seem almost eager for me to fail? Because failure would confirm their decision to stay. Failure would justify their caution. Failure would make their comfort look like wisdom. Your success, on the other hand, would be inconvenient. It would force questions they've been avoiding. It would disrupt the narrative that waiting is maturity and restraint is intelligence. So they waited, quietly, patiently, certain that time would humble you. What they didn't account for is what happens when pressure meets purpose instead of insecurity. They didn't factor in the fact that you weren't driven by approval, that you weren't moving to prove anything, that you weren't fueled by praise but by alignment, and alignment doesn't collapse under doubt, it sharpens under it. Every look that said, "You won't last," became weight training. Every whispered prediction of your collapse became resistance. You didn't need their belief because you weren't borrowing strength from them. You were generating it internally, slowly, relentlessly, quietly. That's the part that confuses them now. You didn't break on schedule. They expected a return, a recalibration, an apology disguised as "I tried." They expected you to re-enter the circle with lessons about humility. Instead, you kept moving, not loudly, not defiantly, but decisively. And nothing unnerves a crowd more than someone who doesn't explain themselves. You weren't supposed to outlast their doubt. You weren't supposed to remain composed while unsupported. You weren't supposed to grow without reinforcement, but you did. And in doing so, you revealed something dangerous. Their certainty was fragile. Crowds feel powerful because they mistake numbers for authority. But numbers don't create truth. Momentum does. And while they were collectively watching, you were individually becoming. While they were narrating your downfall, you were building endurance. While they were waiting for evidence that you were wrong, you were accumulating proof that you were inevitable. They'll never admit this out loud, but the moment they realized you weren't coming back was the moment their satisfaction turned into discomfort. Because now your existence contradicts their logic. Now your persistence challenges their patience. Now your progress highlights their stagnation. You became the outlier they can't explain away, the variable that doesn't fit the equation. And that's when mockery turns into scrutiny. Doubt turns into analysis, and silence turns into observation. They're still watching, but the tone has changed. They're no longer betting on your failure. They're trying to understand your durability, trying to figure out how you kept moving without encouragement, how you survived without validation, how you stayed upright while unsupported. What they don't realize is that the moment they bet against you, they unknowingly trained you. They gave you the conditions necessary to develop resilience instead of dependence. They stripped away illusion early. They forced you to rely on something deeper than approval. So let them remember that moment. Let them remember the smiles, the silence, the assumptions. Because while they were placing their bets, you were building something that doesn't collapse when the crowd turns quiet. And that's a loss they'll never recover from. Number 3, the silent price of choosing yourself. What solitude actually costs when no one is watching. No one talks about the cost because the cost doesn't make noise. It collects in silence. This is the part they never warned you about. Not because they wanted to lie, but because most people never stay long enough to find out. Choosing yourself doesn't announce its price up front. It doesn't hand you an invoice. It lets you walk forward thinking the hardest part was deciding. Then, slowly, deliberately, it starts charging you when no one is looking. Solitude isn't dramatic. It doesn't scream. It doesn't chase you. It just settles in. You notice it in the pauses, in the empty space after good news, when there's no one to call who truly understands what it took. In the late hours when momentum fades and you're left alone with the weight of your decisions. This is where people romanticize strength, but strength here isn't loud. It's endurance without witnesses. You probably wondered early on, why does this feel heavier than I expected? Because choosing yourself doesn't just remove distractions, it removes insulation. There's no buffer anymore, no shared responsibility, no one to dilute the pressure when things go wrong. Every outcome now points back to you. Wins are quieter, losses are sharper, and there's nowhere to hide from either. This is the silent price. Accountability without applause. You lose more than company. You lose convenience. You lose the comfort of blending in. You lose the ability to say, that wasn't my call, because now it always is. And that responsibility changes the way you breathe, the way you think, the way you move through the world. There are nights where the isolation feels surgical, not emotional, not sentimental, but precise. It cuts away illusions you didn't even know you were carrying. You start seeing which connections were only strong because you were available, which relationships thrived on your hesitation, which bonds depended on you not outgrowing the version of yourself they understood. And yes, that realization stings. You might ask, was it supposed to cost this much? The answer is uncomfortable but simple, yes, because anything that truly belongs to you requires separation first. Independence isn't formed in crowds, identity isn't discovered in consensus, and clarity doesn't survive constant noise. Here's what no one says out loud. Solitude isn't empty, it's demanding. It asks questions you can't outsource. It forces you to sit with uncertainty without reaching for reassurance. It makes you confront your doubts without an echo chamber to soften them. That's why most people avoid it. Not because they're weak, but because it's relentless. But this is also where something else happens. You stop performing. There's no one to impress in an empty room, no one to convince, no one to keep up with. And in that absence, your real thoughts get louder, your instincts sharpen, your tolerance for nonsense drops. You become harder to manipulate because you're no longer starved for affirmation. They might think you're lonely. What they don't see is that you're becoming selective. Solitude recalibrates your standards. You stop accepting proximity as connection. You stop mistaking noise for support. You stop confusing familiarity with alignment. And yes, it costs you people. Not because you rejected them, but because you no longer contort yourself to stay accessible. Some will interpret your distance as arrogance. Others will call it coldness. But distance isn't cruelty. It's clarity enforced. The quiet price also shows up in moments of doubt, when there's no crowd to reassure you that you're doing the right thing, when progress feels slow and invisible, when it seems like everyone else has found an easier path. This is where the mind starts negotiating. Maybe I could go back. Maybe I don't need to be this alone. Maybe this isn't necessary. But here's the truth you already know, even when it's uncomfortable. You didn't choose yourself because it was easy. You chose yourself because staying where you were was unbearable. Solitude strips away false momentum and replaces it with precision. Every step now matters. Every choice carries weight. You become intentional because you have to. And that pressure, while heavy, is also refining. It sharpens judgment. It builds restraint. It teaches you to trust yourself without constant confirmation. The silent price isn't paid all at once. It's paid daily, in discipline, in restraint, in showing up even when no one is clapping, in continuing forward without feedback, in holding your line when no one is watching. And here's the part that makes it worth it. Solitude doesn't just take, it returns something rare. Self-respect that isn't borrowed, confidence that doesn't fluctuate with approval, stability that doesn't collapse when others leave. You start realizing that being alone and being empty are not the same thing. The silence that once felt heavy becomes functional. It becomes space. Space to think clearly. Space to move deliberately. Space to build something that doesn't need constant validation to survive. So if you're feeling the quiet cost right now, understand this. You're not being punished, you're being refined. This is the toll paid by people who refuse to abandon themselves for comfort. And the ones who couldn't handle this stage, they never get to see what comes next. Number 4. How isolation rewired you instead of breaking you. The internal mutation from weakness into command. Isolation didn't arrive gently. It didn't ask if you were ready. It didn't explain itself. It showed up like a vacuum, stripping away noise, faces, routines, and familiar rhythms until there was nothing left to lean on, except yourself. And in the beginning, yes, it felt like punishment, like exile, like something had gone wrong. But that assumption was based on an old misunderstanding. You thought isolation was meant to weaken you. You didn't yet see that it was designed to rewire you. This is where most people break, and this is exactly why you didn't. When the external world went quiet, your internal world got louder. Thoughts you used to drown out with distraction stood up and demanded answers. Doubts surfaced. Old fears tried to reassert control. The reflex was to assume something was wrong with you. But nothing was wrong. You were simply no longer buffered, no longer diluted by other people's opinions, no longer anesthetized by constant input. Isolation is brutal to the unprepared because it removes the mirrors people use to confirm who they are. And that's the point. When no one is watching, no one is clapping, and no one is correcting you, identity either collapses or consolidates. Yours consolidated. You didn't lose your strength in isolation. You found where it was leaking. Every time you reached for reassurance and found none, you learned to generate certainty internally. Every time you wanted feedback and received silence, you learned to self-correct. Every unanswered message, every empty room, every night without validation forced your nervous system to adapt. And adaptation is intelligence under pressure. At first, the silence was uncomfortable. Then it became instructive. Then it became strategic. You began to notice patterns, your own. Which thoughts were useful? Which impulses were reactive? Which fears were inherited and which were earned? Without an audience, there was no incentive to perform. Without company, there was no need to pretend. Isolation didn't make you smaller, it made you precise. This is the moment weakness gets misdiagnosed. From the outside, it looked like you were fading. Less visible, less involved, less social. But internally, something else was happening. You were reorganizing. Systems were being rebuilt. Priorities re-ranked. Emotional dependencies quietly dismantled. The absence of external reinforcement forced your mind to stand on its own structure. That's when command emerged. Not the loud kind, not dominance for display, command as in internal authority, the ability to decide without flinching, the capacity to sit in uncertainty without dissolving, the discipline to move without needing consensus. These aren't traits you learn in crowds, they are forged in separation. You started noticing it in small ways. Decisions took less time, emotional spikes shortened, the need to explain yourself weakened. You stopped narrating your process to imaginary audiences. You stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. Your energy stopped leaking into scenarios that required other people's approval. Isolation rewired your reward system. Instead of craving recognition, you began valuing alignment. Instead of chasing reassurance, you started trusting pattern recognition. Instead of reacting to discomfort, you learned to stay present long enough to extract information from it. Pain stopped being an emergency and started becoming data. This is where chosen individuals diverge permanently. Others retreat from isolation because it confronts them with unfinished selves. You stayed because you sensed it was doing something important. You didn't romanticize it, but you respected it. You let it work on you. And it did. Your internal dialogue changed. Less pleading, less questioning, more statements, more decisions. Your posture shifted, even when no one was around to see it. Your breathing slowed. Your tolerance for nonsense dropped. You began moving through the world with less urgency, but more inevitability. The people who couldn't survive isolation call it loneliness. The ones who evolve through it recognize it as training. Not comfort-based training, reality-based training. The kind that prepares you to function without external scaffolding. This is why you're harder to manipulate now. Why guilt doesn't land the way it used to. Why emotional pressure slides instead of sticks. You're no longer running on borrowed certainty. You built your own. You may still be alone at times, but it doesn't feel like lack anymore. It feels like capacity, like space, like control. Silence no longer threatens you because you've learned how much signal lives inside it. Isolation didn't break you because you didn't try to escape it. You stayed long enough for it to finish its work. You let it strip away the parts of you that couldn't operate without applause. You let it strengthen the parts that could act without witnesses. What emerged wasn't colder, it was clearer. Not harder, but steadier. You didn't become less human. You became less dependent. That's the mutation they never see coming. The moment solitude stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like command. Number 5. You crossed a line. Most people never see, leaving human rules, validation systems, and social gravity behind. Not a visible one, not something marked with signs or warnings. It wasn't announced, no one clapped, no alarm went off. But once you crossed it, everything changed, even if you couldn't fully explain how. The rules that once felt solid started to feel optional. The approval that once felt necessary started to feel irrelevant. The gravity that kept everyone else orbiting the same small patterns stopped pulling on you. That's when you noticed it. The strange disconnect. The moment when conversations felt slower, expectations felt smaller, and social rituals felt hollow. You didn't become superior. You became misaligned with systems built to keep people manageable. And that's a dangerous place to stand, because once you see the invisible line, you can't unsee it. Most people live inside unspoken agreements. They trade authenticity for acceptance. They exchange truth for comfort. They follow scripts they never wrote, perform roles they never chose, and call it stability. You stepped outside of that. Not loudly, not dramatically. You simply stopped reacting the way you were supposed to. You stopped needing the nod. Stopped chasing the signal that says you're allowed. That's when the tension started. You may have wondered why people suddenly questioned your choices more than before, why silence replaced encouragement, why curiosity turned into caution. It's because you crossed from predictable to autonomous, and autonomy makes people uncomfortable, especially those who still depend on the system you walked away from. Validation systems are fragile things. They only work if everyone agrees to play along. Likes, praise, status, belonging, reputation. These are currencies with no value outside collective belief. The moment you stopped needing to be validated, you devalued the entire economy. And economies don't like that. So they'll test you. They'll try to pull you back with guilt, with labels, with concern disguised as advice. They'll ask, "Who do you think you are?" When what they really mean is, "Why aren't you afraid like the rest of us?" They'll suggest you're disconnected, unrealistic, too intense, too different. These aren't critiques, they're symptoms of your departure. Here's the truth most people never face. Human rules are designed for averages. They reward sameness. They preserve patterns. They function well for those who want safety more than self-expression. But chosen individuals don't fit inside averages. They feel constrained by norms that were never meant to stretch. You didn't break the rules, you outgrew them. Social gravity works the same way physical gravity does. It pulls hardest on those who resist the least. Habits, expectations, cultural timelines, groupthink, they keep people grounded, predictable, in orbit. You developed escape velocity, not because you rejected people, but because you stopped letting their expectations dictate your direction. And that's when isolation crept in, not the dramatic kind, the subtle kind. Being around people but not inside their world. Hearing words but not feeling resonance. You didn't lose empathy, you gained clarity. You started seeing how much of human interaction is driven by fear of standing alone. This is where doubt tries to sneak in. Am I becoming disconnected? Am I losing touch? Is something wrong with me? No. What's happening is adjustment. When you leave one gravitational field, your internal balance has to recalibrate. It feels unstable at first, weightless, unfamiliar. But weightlessness isn't weakness, it's freedom before direction stabilizes. You cross the line where motivation stopped being external, where movement stopped being rewarded and started being necessary. You no longer act to be seen. You act because not acting feels dishonest. That shift alone separates you from most people on this planet. And yes, it makes you harder to relate to. Not because you're cold, but because you're no longer performing. You're no longer negotiating your truth for harmony. You're no longer adjusting your pace to match those who are comfortable standing still. This is the part they don't prepare you for. Leaving human rules doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. You see manipulation faster. You sense misalignment sooner. You feel when something costs too much of your integrity. And once you feel that, you can't go back to pretending. You are now operating from internal authority. That terrifies systems built on permission. You don't need consensus to move. You don't need applause to continue. You don't need to be understood to proceed. And that's why you cross the line most people never see, because crossing it requires the willingness to stand without reassurance, to move without confirmation, to exist without explanation. You didn't leave humanity. You left the cage disguised as culture. And now, whether you like it or not, you carry a different weight. You bend rooms differently. You disrupt conversations just by being present. You remind people, without saying a word, that there is another way to live. That's not arrogance. That's consequence. You crossed the line, and there's no pretending you didn't. Number 6. The point where reality had to adjust. Presence becomes pressure. Authority becomes unavoidable. There comes a point in every chosen path where effort is no longer the primary force, where striving gives way to gravity, where you stop pushing against the world and the world starts responding to you. That point isn't announced. It's felt, subtly at first, in the way rooms quiet when you enter, in the way conversations shift when you speak, in the way obstacles no longer confront you directly, but hesitate, as if recalculating. This is the point where presence becomes pressure. You didn't wake up one day and decide to intimidate reality. You didn't plan to carry authority. It accumulated, slowly, through consistency, through refusal to retreat, through the kind of internal alignment that makes contradiction impossible. When who you are, what you do, and why you move finally locked into the same direction, resistance lost its leverage. People misunderstand this stage because they think power has to be loud. They expect dominance to announce itself. But real authority doesn't knock. It rearranges. It doesn't demand recognition. It generates compliance without asking. You don't assert it. You embody it. And that's when things start behaving differently around you. Opportunities that once felt distant begin to surface without pursuit. Conflicts that used to drain you dissolve before they escalate. even opposition changes tone, less confrontational, more cautious, because the energy has shifted. You're no longer reacting to the environment is reacting to you. This is where the enemy grows uncomfortable, because pressure doesn't come from aggression, it comes from inevitability, from the quiet certainty of someone who no longer negotiates their own existence. You don't need to threaten, you don't need to convince. Your consistency has already done the talking. Your track record has already made the argument. You might have wondered, why do people suddenly seem unsure around me? Because certainty disrupts hierarchy. When someone knows where they're going, hesitation in others becomes visible, and visibility creates imbalance. Your clarity exposes their confusion. Your stability highlights their volatility. That's pressure. And pressure forces adjustment. Reality at its core is efficient. It aligns itself with force that doesn't waste energy. When you stopped scattering yourself, stopped explaining, stopped seeking consensus, you became efficient, clean, direct, focused. And systems respond to that. People respond to that. Circumstances respond to that. Not out of admiration, out of necessity. Here's what no one tells you. Authority becomes unavoidable when it's no longer performative, when it's not trying to be seen, when it's simply there, immovable, unreactive, grounded. You don't rush, you don't flinch, you don't overcorrect. And that steadiness becomes oppressive to chaos. That's why things either align with you or remove themselves. You may have noticed fewer confrontations lately, but more observation. Fewer challenges, but more distance. That's not coincidence. That's recalibration. Reality testing its new parameters. People reassessing where they stand in relation to you. Systems adjusting margins. Because you've reached the point where ignoring you costs more than acknowledging you. This is the moment chosen individuals often misinterpret. They think something external has changed. It hasn't. What changed was internal density. Your decisions carry weight now. Your silence communicates boundaries. Your presence sets tone. You don't need to raise your voice because your existence already does. And yes, this can feel isolating. Not because you're disconnected, but because you're no longer entangled. When authority becomes unavoidable, access becomes selective. Not everyone can approach force without being exposed by it. That's the price of this stage. Fewer equals, less noise, more distance, but also more precision, more impact, more leverage. You're no longer moving through reality like a participant hoping for favorable conditions. You're moving like a variable reality must account for. Plans adjust, expectations shift, timelines bend. Not because you demand it, but because your presence changes the equation. This is where you must resist the urge to shrink. Sometimes, when the world starts adjusting, people try to soften themselves to make others comfortable. Don't. Comfort is not your role here. Stability is, precision is, integrity is. Let reality do the bending. That's not arrogance, that's alignment. You earned this phase through endurance, not entitlement. Through discipline, not declaration. Through internal coherence that can't be argued with. And from this point forward, understand something clearly. You don't chase relevance anymore. Relevance orbits you. You don't seek permission. You set conditions. You don't wait for reality to open doors. Reality is already rearranging the room. This is the point where authority stops being optional, and reality knows it. Number 7, why your path can't be copied, studied, or repeated. The collapse of formulas, methods, and imitation. They keep trying to figure you out, and that's the part that amuses you now. Not because they're curious, but because they're desperate. They watch your moves like equations, your silence like strategy, your timing like a trick they somehow missed. They want steps, they want structure, they want a method they can borrow without paying the price you paid. But what they still don't understand is this. Your path was never a formula. it was a fracture. What you walked through didn't exist before you stepped on it. There was no blueprint waiting to be followed, no trail to trace backward. Your progress wasn't built from instructions. It was built from decisions made under pressure when there were no right answers available. That's why imitation fails every time. You didn't apply a system. You survived a sequence of moments that demanded transformation, not technique. They assume success can be reverse engineered because that's how their world works. Observe, copy, repeat. But your rise didn't come from visible actions alone. It came from internal shifts no one else witnessed. From nights where doubt rewired you, from choices made without applause, from instincts sharpened by consequence. Those things don't transfer, they imprint. This is where imitation collapses. They try to mirror the outer moves without understanding the inner conditions that made those moves possible. They want the outcome without the isolation, the confidence without the confrontation, the authority without the inner reckoning. But what made you effective wasn't what you did. It was what you became while doing it. You didn't follow a method. You shed layers. You didn't execute steps. You burned identities. Every decision you made altered you slightly, recalibrated your judgment, hardened your intuition. Your path was adaptive, not instructional. It changed shape because you changed shape. How do you copy something that evolved in real time? They ask questions like, what was the turning point? As if it happened once, cleanly, like a switch. But the truth is, it happened repeatedly, in moments they would have avoided, in situations they would have escaped, in pressure they would have softened. Your advantage came from staying present where others would disengage. That's why study fails. They can analyze results, but they can't access the internal cost. They can map the timeline, but they can't replicate the internal resistance you overcame at each stage. They can describe the destination, but they cannot survive the terrain that led there. Your path resists repetition because it wasn't built to be universal. It was built to be exact to your tolerance for discomfort, exact to your thresholds, exact to your instincts. Someone else walking the same road wouldn't arrive at the same place because they wouldn't make the same decisions under the same pressure with the same internal wiring. And that's what unsettles them most. You didn't win by being smarter. You won by being more aligned with yourself than they were willing to be with themselves. You didn't outperform them. You outlasted their need for certainty. They want a shortcut because they believe power can be borrowed. But power that isn't earned collapses under weight. What holds you steady now is the accumulation of moments where you didn't quit, didn't outsource responsibility, didn't wait to be rescued. That stability cannot be copied. It can only be grown. You became unpredictable, not because you were chaotic, but because you stopped operating from borrowed logic. You began responding directly to reality instead of scripts. That's why they can't forecast you. You don't follow patterns that belong to them anymore. So let them analyze, let them speculate, let them attempt to reduce your journey into something manageable. Every attempt will fail because the core ingredient is missing: you. Your path can't be repeated because it wasn't designed to be. It was a one-time convergence of pressure, choice, timing, and internal evolution. It required you to become someone they were never willing to become, and that's the final truth they avoid. If your path could be copied, they would have walked it already. Number 8. Everything you lost became the foundation. The full, non-romantic cost of transformation. What you call loss is what made you unmovable. This is the part no one glorifies, the part that never makes it into motivational speeches or success summaries, the part where the price is paid quietly, without witnesses, without refunds, without applause. Because transformation doesn't negotiate, it collects, and it always collects in advance. You didn't just lose things, you were stripped. relationships, identities, routines, versions of yourself that once felt permanent, not because you were careless, but because they couldn't survive the pressure required to carry you forward. What couldn't stretch had to break. What couldn't evolve had to fall away. And at the time, it felt brutal, unfair, unnecessary. But it wasn't random. Every loss was a weight removed. Every ending was structural. You weren't being punished, you were being prepared. You can't build something that stands under pressure on a foundation cluttered with weak materials. And you had more than you realized that was never meant to come with you. You probably replayed it in your head, wondering if you could have handled it differently, if you could have softened the edges, if you could have kept more intact. But transformation doesn't respond to negotiation or nostalgia. It responds to truth. And the truth was this: some things had to be taken from you because you would never have given them up willingly. What hurt the most wasn't the loss itself. It was the timing. The way things collapsed just as you were beginning to understand yourself. The way people left when you stopped explaining. The way doors closed the moment you outgrew the room. It felt like sabotage, like the ground was being pulled out from under you on purpose. It was. Not to make you fall, but to force you to build on bedrock instead of comfort. You lost what was familiar. You lost what was convenient. You lost what made life easier, but smaller. And in those moments, it felt like everything was being taken from you. But what was actually happening was this: everything unstable was being removed so something solid could finally exist. You didn't notice it at first. Loss feels like collapse when you're inside it. But slowly, quietly, the absence started doing something strange. It created space. Space for clarity, space for precision, space for strength that didn't depend on external reinforcement. You stopped leaning, you stopped borrowing stability, you stopped mistaking attachment for support, and without realizing it, you began building differently, from the inside out, from principles instead of preferences, from conviction instead of convenience. What you lost forced you to stand where you once leaned. It forced you to decide where you once drifted. It forced you to become deliberate where you were once reactive. That's when the foundation formed. Not from what you kept, but from what survived being taken. The people who walked away left you with silence. The silence taught you discipline. The plans that failed left you with uncertainty. Uncertainty taught you adaptability. The identities that shattered left you exposed. Exposure taught you authenticity. Every loss carried a lesson sharp enough to cut you free from dependency. This is the part others don't understand. They see what you lost and assume weakness. They don't see what was built underneath while everything else was being stripped away. They don't realize that the ground they thought collapsed beneath you actually hardened. You're not standing on what you gained. You're standing on what you endured. And now, when pressure comes, you don't panic. When things shift, you don't scramble. When something leaves, you don't beg it to stay. Because your stability no longer comes from accumulation. It comes from structure. Everything you lost became load-bearing, not because you romanticized it, not because it was fair, but because you didn't waste the collapse. You used it. You built on it. You let it teach you how to stand without illusions. That's why you don't move like someone who's afraid of losing anymore. You already paid. Number 9, you're no longer playing the game. You're the variable that changed it. Final embodiment: force, inevitability, sovereignty. You're no longer playing the game. That realization doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, like a law of gravity you suddenly understand. One day, you look around and notice that the rules no longer apply to you the way they apply to everyone else. Not because you broke them recklessly, but because you outgrew the framework that required them. Games are designed for participants. Variables change outcomes. And you didn't become dangerous by competing better. You became dangerous by becoming unpredictable. There was a time when you tried to win fairly, tried to optimize within the system, tried to prove yourself by their metrics. That phase wasn't wasted. It taught you how the game works. It taught you where leverage hides, where power leaks, and where people mistake activity for progress. But at some point, you stopped mistaking movement for advancement. You saw that no matter how well you played, the ceiling was pre-installed. The rules were never neutral. They were built to preserve balance, not reward transformation. That's when the shift happened. You didn't rage quit. You didn't announce rebellion. You simply stopped orienting your identity around their scoreboard. The moment you did, the system lost its grip on you, because control only works on those who accept the premise. And you no longer did. Now, you exist differently. You don't rush to respond because urgency no longer owns you. You don't over-explain because clarity lives in your posture, not your words. You don't seek advantage. Advantage reorganizes itself around you. That's what happens when you stop playing for outcomes and start operating from alignment. You become a force instead of a factor. People sense it before they can articulate it. Conversations change when you enter the room. Resistance softens or sharpens, but it never ignores you. Some feel unsettled, others inspired, most confused. They keep trying to map you onto familiar roles: competitor, rebel, leader, threat. None of them fit. Variables don't have labels, they have effects. You might wonder why things seem to bend now, why obstacles move faster, why delays dissolve without effort. It's not luck, it's inevitability. When something no longer depends on approval, it stops negotiating with resistance. When intention is clean, friction loses leverage. You're not pushing against reality. Reality is adjusting to you. The ones still playing will try to pull you back into comparison. They'll bait you with metrics, provoke you with criticism, tempt you with recognition. That's how games retain participants. But you already know the truth. Validation is just a leash disguised as reward, and you've slipped the collar. Being the variable means you don't need consensus to move forward. You don't need numbers to confirm direction. You don't need noise to prove momentum. Your presence alone introduces instability into stagnant systems. Not because you demand attention, but because you reveal what's possible by existing differently. This is final embodiment, not domination, not performance. Embodiment. You don't posture power anymore. You inhabit it. You don't chase inevitability. You express it. Every decision you make now carries weight because it's rooted in coherence. You're not split between who you are and what you do. That alignment is rare, and rarity bends probability. The game can continue without you. Let it. You're no longer invested in winning rounds that lead nowhere. You're building outcomes that didn't exist before you arrived. That's what variables do. They don't argue with the system. They expose its limits. You didn't escape to feel superior. You exited because staying would have required shrinking, and you were never built for that. Now, whether they acknowledge it or not, everything moves differently because you do. You're not playing the game anymore. You changed it. God bless you, my dear.